welcome to Keep the Bastards Honest, the podcast of the Australian Democrats. I'm your host, Elana Mitchell, and on this episode, Labor's win for the ages. Well, no one expected that result, not even Labor. The word historic gets bandied about a lot, but that truly was a historic result in the absolute correct sense of that word. To discuss the election results while we wait for the very complicated Senate count to be completed and our results finalised, my exceptional co-host Steve Beatty joins me. And in light of the collapse of support for the Liberal Party, I've called on someone with a unique insight into the inner workings of the Liberal Party of Australia. Andre Shannon is our WA State Secretary and serves as the Democrats' campaign manager. Now, I feel bad for Andre because it seems like every time I introduce him to anyone in the party, I force him to confess his dark past. Indeed, when I conducted Andre's membership interview when he joined the party, the first thing he said to me was, "I have a confession to make." And rather naively, I said, "Oh, that's okay. I won't judge you. What do you need to tell me?" And Andre said, "I was a senior member of the WA Liberal Party for 20 years. And I went, "Oh, okay." And then we spoke about politics for 2 hours because Andre had walked away from the Liberal Party at the beginning of 2019. And when he joined the Democrats 2 years later, he hadn't spoken to anyone about politics, or anyone in politics for that matter, for that entire time. So he had a lot of catching up to do when he encountered a fellow political enthusiast. Andre, as a former Liberal staffer, branch president and campaign committee chair, was at ground zero for a lot of the events, decisions and cultural shifts within the Liberal Party over the last 20 years that have led them to the most devastating result since the 1940s, which was when they were formed. So as you can imagine, he has some thoughts and some insights to share with everyone. I do have to warn you, this episode is a long one. In a party where being a talker is almost a cultural trait, I'm definitely a poster child for that, as regular listeners to the podcast will know. And possibly the only two people who can outdo me on being chatty would be Andre and Steve, and I put them together. So I hope you enjoy listening to this discussion as much as we enjoyed having it. So let's get into it. Andre, Steve and I pay our respects to the traditional custodians of the lands that we recorded this episode on, and their elders past and present. Sovereignty never ceded.
I still sort of have Dora the Explorer going through my head, Andre.
We've carefully avoided Dora the Explorer.
Oh, okay. Because
I find her a bit loud and annoying.
Yeah.
It's like Peppa Pig. I find Peppa Pig rude and annoying.
Yeah, fair.
Bluey I can handle.
I love Bluey.
But yeah, Dora's a bit yelly.
Yeah, look, it's all about the backpack, apparently.
Do you know what's interesting? This is actually more sophisticated than the Liberals' campaign during this election.
Yeah.
This discussion.
No, I know. I'm curious, like, how you feel about it all, Andre, but I found myself in a very strange position during the day reading various post-election analyses and listening to various people talk and that kind of thing, that on the one hand agreeing vehemently with the likes of Ronnie Salt and Amy Ramikis and Dave Milbo and Tim Dunlop and Tim Baxter, who's a climate analyst, and a whole bunch of these left-leaning sort of people, and being quite in violent agreement with them and their analysis, which is that the Liberal campaign was kind of shit, but also finding myself agreeing equally vehemently with Holly Hughes and Dave Sharma and Alexander Downer, because they were saying that the Liberal campaign was kind of shit. And I struggle with that, although I agree with all of them for similar reasons. There's something about me that finds that sort of cognitive dissonance isn't quite the right word, but there's something going on in there that just made me go, this is a beautiful moment that for the first time in a long time, and not really intentionally, the Liberal Party managed to unite a very broad section of the Australian public.
Yeah. The broadest ever,
to vehemently agree that their campaign was shit.
A shambles, Alexander Downer called it. A shambles.
Yeah.
But, you know, I have to say, I think a campaign is a reflection of the talent and thinking within a party.
Yes.
So it's not like, they had really great people and really great ideas and it's just the campaign execution was poor. I think the shambolic nature of the campaign was a reflection of just the degradation.
A shambolic party.
Yep. It's degraded massively. And, I have my thoughts on that.
Yeah. But it's also not a new thing or a recent thing or an unexpected thing. It's been 20 years in the making.
Yeah, and it's certainly accelerated.
Yeah.
I think the minute that Malcolm Turnbull was ousted in favour of Scott Morrison, that was sort of the day where you could go, okay, the Liberal Party's jumped the shark now. Like that was the point where it became, there's no recovering from this. And unfortunately fortunately, depends on your viewpoint. That's what has happened.
Well, I don't think a weak Liberal Party and a weak opposition is good for the country as a whole. I'm certainly happy to see a party that keeps marching further and further to the right not be rewarded with electoral success. Like that part fills me with a great deal of joy. But the fact that we don't have a strong opposition is a concern. Right? Yeah. But there's a scene, I don't know whether you remember the movie The Great Escape. Do you remember that wartime movie, The Great Escape? There's a scene in The Great Escape where as they're tunnelling, they need to shore up the tunnel. And in order to shore up the tunnel, they keep stealing slats from the bunk beds.
Yeah.
And they take like occasional 1 in 4 or 1 in 3, and they sort of spread the load around, and eventually they have taken so many of the support structures that people start collapsing through the beds.
Yes.
And I think that's what we've seen metaphorically in this election, is that all of the infrastructure, the quality and the supports at all sorts of levels, all the way down to volunteers and how to vote card volunteers on pre-poll and on polling day, where the quality of all of that infrastructure has deteriorated to the point where the vote is collapsing and the representation is going to collapse, like you saw in WA, and you've seen it twice now, and they recovered a little bit, but only because they couldn't possibly get worse. But that for me is a good metaphor. It's just like they've eroded the infrastructure to the point where they're now collapsing in on themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that they lost... So in WA, I mean, we'll be parochial about it. In WA, the fact that they lost Curtin was just unbelievable. The only time since, I think, World War II... Well, since Curtin existed as a seat, which I think was the 1950s, but I could be wrong. The only time it's ever not been held by a Liberal previously was when Alan Rocher, who was a Liberal and John Howard's best mate, got rolled for pre-selection by Ken Court, Richard Court's brother, in a factional deal by Noel Crichton Brown. Okay. And Alan Rocher contested that election as an independent, but had the full backing of then Prime Minister John Howard, who was, was saying, "Oh no, that's my pal," and so won it again. And so it was actually the next election, the GST election. It was '98 when Julie Bishop contested, and she won the seat. So for them to lose Curtin to Kate Chaney was almost unthinkable. Then for her to secure it again, and I can tell you that their candidate Tom White is a real darling of the factional warlords here in WA. I've known Tom for quite some time. Hi Tom, if you're listening, probably not. But that they clearly put a lot of time and a lot of money into that campaign. They really wanted to get Curtin back, and they did not.
Yeah,
and by a reasonable margin, Kate Chaney's secured it.
Back in. Yeah.
I spent 2 weeks on pre-poll with Tom's dad.
Oh,
nice.
Hi, Tom's dad, if you're listening. Yeah. He was very nice.
Yeah.
Welcome, guys.
Yeah.
Yes. Welcome. Hello. Let's talk.
It is interesting. So I know there's been a meme of Senator McGrath saying, "Let's wait for the postals. Let's wait for the postals."
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Which, I mean, he was grabbing for whatever rope there was that he could try to retain some sort of hope or dignity. But to some extent, the postal votes coming in have shifted things a bit closer in some of those teal seats. So it'll be interesting to see.
Not enough for the Liberal Party to take government, though.
No, definitely not. No.
which James seemed to be angling for. Well, hang on. I know Peter's behind on a 20-point margin, but we should just wait until the postal votes come in.
Yeah, I think if everyone who'd already voted on polling day and pre-poll had also voted postal, it still wouldn't have been enough to get them into government. But it certainly has narrowed some of those contests, and it might
has
upset
some,
all
yes.
those three-corner contests as well with the Greens. So it'll just be interesting to see how that plays out. I think it's pretty knife edge over here in the new seat of Bullwinkle too. I think it's literally 50-50.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
I think at the moment they're projecting that the ALP might take Bullwinkle, but that's at the time of recording.
Ahead. Oh goodness, 28 votes in it.
Oh my God.
And see, that was because Mia Davies, the former National Party state MP over here, was running as a federal candidate. So
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, she used to be the WA opposition leader for those Eastern Nullarbor.
Yeah. Okay.
That's true. Right. I always forget that there was that little period there.
So as a result, there was a 15% swing towards the Nationals in Bullwinkle.
Yeah.
As a result, I assume basically because of her.
Yeah. I think it was
interesting.
It was probably from 0 to 15 would be my guess.
Well, no, 16 and a half. So 16.4. So there was tiny little vote for her last time around and it picked up a little bit. But interestingly, the Liberal vote was down nearly 10%.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to map sometimes when there are those redistributions. So
yeah.
But yeah, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, the Liberal brand is pretty on the nose here in WA, and they've just got no resources here at all.
Can I ask a broad question for the pair of you? Were you surprised by the results nationally?
So I was on pre-poll for the 2 weeks leading up to the election, then obviously was on a booth all day on election day. And by the beginning of the second week of pre-poll, I was starting to suspect that we would get a majority Labor government. That was just sort of the vibe that I was getting in a very, very unscientific sort of anecdotal observation, because my pre-poll booth that I was at serviced Curtin, Cowan, Moore and Perth. And there was a contingent of sort of clearly diehard Liberal voters across those 4 electorates. Yep. But the response that I was getting as a Democrat and the response I was observing to the Labor volunteers and even the Greens to a degree, although I have an interesting story about the Greens for a bit later on, it did feel very, very pro-Labor. And it was an interesting mix because it was 4 different electorates. And obviously massive, massive Kate Chaney sort of vibes as well. And it was fascinating to me because I would see people, the only how to vote card they would take would be Kate Chaney's. And I'd wander up to them and go, can I offer you Australian Democrat for the Senate? And they go, oh, no, I'm all good. And I'd go, yes, but this is for the Senate. This is for the white ballot paper. And they'd be like, oh, the Senate. And then they take my how to vote card.
Hadn't thought about the Senate.
Exactly.
Okay.
They were so focused on supporting Kate, they forgot that there was 2 ballot papers. And like some of them were just like, no, I'm good. And some of them were clearly going to vote Labor or Greens in the Senate, which is fine. Yep. But yeah, I think the number of voters I converted by just gently reminding them that the Senate existed, I think helped us. And so, so by the beginning of last week, I was like, I think this is going to be a majority Labor government. I did not expect it to be this kind of majority. That shocked me. I was not shocked by the result, but I was shocked by just the scale of it was astonishing. Andre?
Yeah.
I'd suspected for quite some time that the polls were not right. The knife edge polls just, and look, I mean, to some extent, it's always a bit difficult because if you're over here in WA, you're just really getting a sense of people in WA. But I actually think that nowadays, it used to be that it was always a pretty pro-Liberal state here, and so you would get a sense that our Liberal government was perhaps more secure than what it was. But since McGowan was premier, I think, and since COVID, it's been a much more balanced sort of view. And the strong feeling I got was that nobody really, other than diehard, like ultra, like liberals, like dyed-in-the-wool conservatives who were never going to vote anything other than Liberal except maybe One Nation, they were like, we hate Albanese. Everyone else you spoke to didn't really they weren't thrilled with Albanese. I don't think anyone was super excited about, it's been so great having Anthony Albanese as Prime Minister and we can't wait for another 3 years. I don't think anyone, I didn't encounter anyone with that sort of effusive reaction to him. But the feeling about Dutton was just palpably bad. And I know they're trying to shoot at home. They're going, oh, well, then Donald Trump came along. I think that certainly exacerbated the problem, but I think it was a problem before that. I think people just had a natural wariness of him. He didn't inspire great confidence. And as I've said a couple of times, the worst thing was you look past him to the team behind him and you go, oh dear, is he actually the best of the bunch?
Yeah, he might actually be.
Yeah. Whereas with Albanese, you were going, oh, well, there are other competent people here. And even somebody I know who's been a pretty strong Liberal for a long time basically said, it would be really hard from a pragmatic, sensible, logical point of view to pick the federal Liberal team over the federal Labor team in terms of capability and competence. So I didn't expect the victory to be this big, but I did expect that Labor would win a parliamentary majority.
Yeah. The point about Trump, I think the timing of Trump's inauguration and the sort of ramping up of the rhetoric and then him actually enacting some of his policies coincided with a few events here that put Dutton in a position where he had to front the media and front some serious scrutiny for the first time in 3 years.
Yep.
And he sucks at it. He's terrible at it. He's just terrible at it. The stories that I've heard over the last sort of 48 hours about him actually being quite a warm person and him actually being quite an empathetic person, if that's actually true, and I don't really believe it, but if it is actually true, he does a damn good job of hiding it. Because when he speaks in public and when he responds to questions and when he engages with the media, even the friendliest media, there's no hint of a person who is good-humoured or warm or friendly or engaging or any of those sorts of things. Like, he literally does come across as a sort of thuggish ex-policeman. There's no warmth there. There's the same, literally there's the same warmth when I grab potatoes out of the cupboard. There's just nothing. And there really is just nothing. And so I think that heightened scrutiny where he was put in the spotlight and people started demanding answers from him and actually holding him to account on some of his answers and sort of, hang on a minute, you're avoiding the question. He really did fall apart in that kind of environment. And it only got worse. The whole thing with the cyclone, so him flying off to Sydney and then trying to make excuses about, but I was back for when it hit and I wasn't really sort of doing anything useful anyway, alongside Chalmers, who's in shorts and thongs and a T-shirt filling sandbags and shoveling sand into bags and helping his community, even though, sure, that's literally a drop in the bucket of what's required in a community trying to deal with a serious cyclone. But at least he was there rather than doing black tie fundraisers and trying to juggle his commitments. And it just went downhill from there before we even get to their policy and before we even get to the way in which they ran their campaign.
It was the perfect storm of Trump sort of really hitting the ground running on implementing his more insane policies, hit at the exact moment when people started to pay attention to politics because they knew an election was coming. Like back in March, we had a state election here. And so the WA electorate was very, very politically awake, so to speak. And then, of course, because of the WA election, everybody fully expected Albanese to, and when I say everybody, I mean the media, but there was this clear narrative of, Albanese will call the election the day after the WA state election, which he didn't do, but there was that expectation there. And so the rest of the nation, I think, was also waking up to the possibility of a federal election being imminent. And that meant everybody was paying attention just at the moment as Elon Musk is wielding a chainsaw and cutting air traffic controller jobs and all that sort of stuff. And people saw in real time what happens when you let a right-wing populist have unfettered power to implement his policies. And they took one look at Dutton and went, no, thank you.
Well, and I think it was a mistake on his part and their part to appoint Price as the Shadow Minister for Government Efficiency.
Oh my God,
right?
yes.
Because it played into that whole rhetoric and that whole ideology of waste in public sector, we're going to cut back on, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it ties them with Trump, so then you've got that close association, and it certainly doesn't help, even if it didn't necessarily hurt, but it certainly didn't help. And then you start asking questions like, well, A, why would you give any responsibility to Price in the first place?
Yes.
And B, you already have a shadow minister of government waste. I can't remember the guy's name, but you already have a shadow minister for government waste. So now you've got one for government efficiency, which doesn't sound very fucking efficient to me, but that's just...
Well, that's right up there with Elon Musk and whoever the other dude was. They were both going to be running.
That's right.
So why do you need two of them? Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But the thing about Dutton that just really getting back to the lack of warmth, like the number of times over the past 6 years that he has had to reintroduce himself to the public and soften his image.
Yeah.
And he's not done it very well. From the moment he challenged Malcolm Turnbull,
Getting his wife to tell people that
he's
he's
not a
monster.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know about you, Andre, and your sort of life and career, but I'm yet to have to play that card.
No, I've never had to have my wife or my ex-wife trotted out to tell people I'm not a monster.
No, not yet. No.
Yeah, I will give it time. Give it time.
The constant having to try and not even reinvent himself, but attempting to reveal that, actually, despite this hard man, sort of slightly thuggish aura that I've had for the last 20 odd years in politics, I'm actually a warm, fuzzy, decent guy. And he was so unconvincing at it. That's the thing that got me, I think, was the number of times he had to have a crack at it, and each time was somehow managed to be worse. And, utterly failing to convince anyone of it.
Yeah, right up to the text messages from Kiralee the day before going, Peter's a really nice guy.
Oh, it's kind of sad.
Yeah. So let me ask you a different question, and just let me lay out a scenario for you, and let me tell me whether you agree or not, kind of thing. But just looking at what the Liberal Party needed to achieve in order to win government at the beginning of the campaign, right? So this is how I saw it going into the campaign. They needed to hold Queensland.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
They needed to hold and gain in New South Wales. And those gains needed to be either in Western Sydney or in the Northern Beaches, in the seats that they lost to Scomps, Spender. So they had to hold Bradfield now that North Sydney's gone, Wentworth, etc. They had to win those back. They had to try and win some in Western Sydney, get back Bennelong, win, somewhere else, but get some of those Western Sydney seats. And they needed to do the same in Victoria. So the seats that they had lost last time around, they needed to win some of those back. So that's inner city Melbourne, quite a environmentally conscious group in both locations. The Northern Beaches of Sydney, very environmentally conscious, big on women, big on equality, big on transparency and integrity, big on climate in both locations. Western Sydney, lots of migrants, lots of people interested in how Australia treats migrants, big Chinese populations, and then really sort of hold everywhere else and try and gain one or two in WA.
Yep.
And that might have got them back to 76, 77 if they could do all of that.
Yeah.
Right? That. And do you agree sort of broadly that was the equation?
Yeah, that is basically what they needed to do.
Right?
Yeah. And also not lose anything.
Absolutely. So they had to hold everything and then win back those ones. So if I then go and take a look at, what would be important to those areas? So climate action is clearly a big one. So in the inner sort of suburbs of Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne in particular, you've got strong action on climate as a necessity. Women's issues, equality, health, early childhood education, getting women back into the workforce, so workforce participation, those sorts of issues, and then dealing in integrity, transparency, those sorts of issues as well. And then how we treat migrants. So how we deal with foreign policy, our attitudes towards Muslims, our attitudes towards China, etc., would all have played importantly in places like Reed in Sydney, which is as an increasingly Chinese population. Banks is another one with an increasingly Chinese population. Bennelong, same deal. So our attitudes towards China are important. Similar things going on in some of the outer suburbs of Melbourne, Muslim populations, Asian populations, and how we view migrants being important. Given that that was the equation, how would you rate their approach to policy and their strategy in response to that as being what they had to achieve? Give me a score out of 10, Andre.
About -3.
Okay. I'll get you to elaborate in a second. Elena, what would you give them?
Oh, I feel like Andre sort of built the cat with a -3, but yeah, definitely 0, potentially into the negatives.
All right. So why? Like,
Andre,
what do you think they did wrong, Andre?
I think in part they literally took people who were either neutral or slightly positive to them and made it impossible for them to be anything other than anti them. Certain people think that immigrants, in inverted commas, that it's a simple them and us. There are Australians and there are immigrants.
Yep.
And the reality is Australians are a pretty varied group of people. Some are Indigenous. Some people have been here, were brought here. Their ancestors were brought here involuntarily and they've been here a very long time. Others are pretty recent, and all of those people consider themselves Australian. And in my experience, every single cohort of those people includes people who think there is too much immigration, including people who are recent immigrants. So
yes.
So that much is true. However, I think the Australian community has become so broad and we are so reliant on immigration that every single person you could possibly meet has friends, relatives, loved ones, work colleagues who are immigrants. And just about everyone knows people who are here on a student visa or came here on a student visa and are now here because they're working or whatever it may be. I'm married to someone in that category.
Same.
And I think they were so enamored of that American Republican MAGA approach of immigration is the problem. We can really tap into that because we can try and hook everything on. Oh, it's an environmental issue. It's a cost of living issue. It's a housing issue. It was their excuse for everything was, there are just too many immigrants. And then that argument becomes exposed so quickly when you go, well, hang on, there's also people are trying to build houses frantically because we don't have enough houses and we can't get them built very quickly because there aren't enough people to build them. We've got an NDIS that's growing day after day, but we're constantly struggling to deliver the services that need to be delivered because there aren't enough people to actually deliver the services. And we go into Coles and we go into Woolies and wherever else and we're doing our own checkout work because there aren't enough people to work in the checkouts. And suddenly you start to go, hang on a minute, do you think maybe the immigration is a way of having enough people to do these jobs? And I mean, don't get me wrong, part of it is just some of these places just don't want to pay people properly, Coles and Woolies. But I think there is this connection between the simple maths of going more immigrants means less for the rest of us. I think most people now are sophisticated enough to see that as a furphy and to realise that it's way more complicated than that, and that in a country like Australia that has a reasonably small population that is geographically spread out, and we don't have a really strong birth rate, as most OECD countries don't. What we rely on is immigration to boost things up. And I think most people figure that out. And so I think their attempt to capitalise on the feelings of a few just didn't work. And it turned people against them.
I mean, look, they kind of tried, and some of those The Heartland seats they lost to the Community Independents in 2022, you could see them trying. You could see them going and finding the, on paper, professional woman to go up against Gomps and
as a candidate,
as a candidate,
sure.
and that sort of thing. You could tell that somewhere in the Liberal Party hindbrain, some sense of survival had kicked in, and they were like, we do actually need to find women to run against these. If we want these seats back, we need to. And because the common argument has been those 6 seats in particular, all of those women who currently hold them realistically should have been members of the Liberal Party.
It's probably true, but still,
Still, yeah. So it was interesting to me that they managed to find, I think it was Kapterian in Bradfield to replace Paul Pletcher. I forget. And then Amelia Hamer.
We'll talk about her in a minute because that's worth a chat.
So you sort of got this, but it kind of backfired on them in that it came across not as we have listened, we are learning, we are, we're doing what we should have done 15 years ago, and we're starting to promote and develop these female candidates. It just somehow, and again, this is the whole everything doesn't touch turn to feces phenomenon that he went through, but it looked tokenistic and kind of condescending to suddenly be running this handful of, on paper, Liberal from central casting women in seats that they had lost to strong female candidates 3 years beforehand. And somehow they missed the mark. It really smacked of the abusive boyfriend going, no, really, I'll give up drinking and I'll try. And you know for a fact that he's lying to you. And that's how it somehow managed to come across. It was not, we have listened, we have learned, we are changing. It was, we have found token crumb maidens who will do our bidding. And I think the electorate saw through it.
Well, I mean, part of the argument, and I saw one senior Liberal woman, and I can't remember who it was, although I wish I did, but sort of make the point that, what those electorates need is a woman MP. They've got one.
That's and I think that was
they have one. Yes. They have a really impressive one. They all do. These are all very, very impressive candidates. Like, you can't point to any of them. Like, if you look across that cohort of women who won those seats, and it looks like by and large holding them, there's a couple of pretty tight races. But, Sophie Scomps increased her margin. It looks like Monique Ryan has increased her margin. Kate Chaney has increased her margin because people have seen just how good a job they're doing. Representing their electorate, and whatever fears or hesitation they might have had in the past, they've looked at it and gone, actually, these people are really impressive, and I can see they're trying their ass off to represent us in our needs rather than represent the party. So why would I go back to party politics with a second-rate female candidate when I can have a really impressive first-rate candidate whose sole focus is on us?
Yes, that's what it smacked of. Is you guys wanted a female MP? Oh, we'll give you one, and then now you can come back to the Liberal fold. Everyone's gone, no,
not in McKellar where they put up James Brown, who's
hardest working man in politics.
But what I found fascinating is that, like, in the lead up to the election, and again, once again, the media. And this is probably going to be a discussion unto itself. The media just completely read the room wrong. But the speculation that Chaney and Sophie Scomps would lose their seats, but they both increased their margin. But I find it fascinating that it's Zoe Daniel and Monique Ryan who are under a bit of pressure down in Melbourne, and everybody else is absolutely romped it in.
It's hard to pick these things sometimes. The swings go all over the place.
And a lot of resources have been thrown at both Goldstein and Kooyong. A lot of resources.
I mean,
it'll be interesting to see just how much, but a lot has gone into those.
They're real jewels in the crown, frankly. They're seats that the Liberal Party really loves. But it wasn't just women that they tried to emulate. You've got in WA in Tangney, you've got Sam Lim for the Labor Party who won. Tangney, which is was always a very safe Liberal seat, and he won it. The former Dolphin trainer, and so the Liberal Party found Howard Ong, originally from Singapore, to run against him. And we saw it in the state election too, Elana, here in WA. There were areas where there were Labor members of, a particular ethnicity, and suddenly they would find a Liberal Party candidate of the same ethnicity to run against them. And it's like, that's not how it's going to work, guys. Like, they weren't just voting on that.
It's taking the complete wrong lesson out of the result from last time around, which they seem to have done fairly consistently.
It really is. And if I can hint very broadly at what may be one of the big problems in the Liberal Party is that inevitably those people all subscribe to a particular flavour of religious persuasion. The growing influence of certain Christian church groups in the Liberal Party has really had a really negative impact on their electoral appeal.
Yeah, interestingly, Andre, that was one of the points that Alexander Downer was making about South Australia, is the influence of Alex, what's his name, Antics, and his sort of, I think, Pentecostalism, and how that has influenced party membership and pre-selections and then candidates, and how poorly they have performed as a result, largely driven by him and his religious affiliations.
Well, that's exactly what happened in WA.
Yeah, and for Downer to call that out publicly was surprising to me. What Antic has been doing is not surprising. We've sort of seen that with Morrison for sort of 6 years or so, and we've seen it in New South Wales as well. But it was interesting to see a Liberal Party figure like that call it out.
Yeah.
So clearly.
Yeah.
It really is. I know some very nice people who have strong religious convictions.
It's not that's the issue, right?
It's not that's the problem. The issue is there are people who are using church allegiance and pushing that into politics, and they think that that's a way to succeed. And despite all the evidence, they continue to think that. And it's just been a way of, it's just tanking the Liberal Party. And they just don't seem to get it. And I said to Elana I think it was on election day, if this goes badly for the Liberal Party, just wait. Somebody will say it's because we weren't right wing enough. And sure enough, it was like 20 minutes after the announcement. It was like, we weren't right wing enough. And that, unfortunately, since about 2004, that has been the response almost universally in the Liberal Party, state and federal levels.
Yeah,
I mean, there was a brief reprieve when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister.
Agreed.
But seriously, it has just been, it's because we weren't right-wing enough. And it's like you keep getting beaten by progressive left-wing parties, and yet you think the problem that people literally voted Labor and Greens because you weren't
right wing enough. And what's odd is that if you count up all of the votes available to the right of where the Liberal Party is right now, so all of the votes that went to Trumpet of Patriots and One Nation and the Australian Christians and whoever else sits to the right of them, if that's where you think the votes are, there's like an extra 2% of the population that sits that direction. Like you're not really getting a majority government over there. You're not. The biggest chunk of votes comes from One Nation. Even if you picked up all of those,
still wouldn't be enough.
You literally don't win any more seats.
No.
You hold the ones that you already hold, but you don't win any new ones.
Yeah.
And that's the weird part.
And unfortunately, I keep saying unfortunately, but this all keeps coming back to a strange, unhealthy obsession in the Liberal Party since it's hard to pinpoint, but since about 2006, with US Republican messaging and tactics. Ever since the whole Tea Party, Tea Party,
yep.
Who I think are like proto-MAGA, but that movement. There were large sections of the Liberal Party who really loved that and wanted to keep trying to bring those tactics and those messages across from US politics. And the reality in Australia, number one, frankly, we're better educated. So straight up, I'll just say that. We're better educated.
Yep.
And number 2, we have compulsory voting. And number 3, we have preferential voting.
Yeah.
Those factors mean that Australian contests are won in the centre.
Yes.
If you can hold the centre, you will win. Whereas in the US and in a lot of other places, most starkly in the US, you have to hold your base. And I've heard people in the Liberal Party talking about, we've got to appeal to the base. You've got to hold the base, blah, 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 blah. Base. And it never made any sense because where were those people going to go? The most they were going to do is, as you say, I'm going to throw my vote to the Christians or, One Nation or the Nats or, the Libertarians or someone.
Yeah.
But because of preferential voting, that was inevitably going to come back to the Liberal. Like it just didn't. It did not make any sense at all. And I think it just, as that progressed through and became then, that Trump MAGA, but that
really
was it.
Toxic. Yeah.
And it is just toxic. And I think the vast majority of people see it for that, and they've overwhelmingly rejected it at this election.
And look, the parties that we're talking about to the right of the Liberal Party won 0 seats.
Yes.
Yeah.
So not in any electorate at all were there enough votes to the right of the Liberal Party that the Liberal Party's preferences flowed further right.
Yeah.
Right? Like it didn't happen that way. So it only happened that those further right votes flowed back to the Liberal Party anyway. And even then there weren't enough, right?
Bob Catter.
Oh, yeah, Bob's.
But he's an exception to all rules.
Bob, I think Bob transcends left-right dichotomies.
Yeah. Bob was a whole political ideology unto himself.
Yeah. But you're 100% right.
But yeah. And look, I agree, though, that the response, and we've seen it from Rowan Dean and Andrew Bolt and Peter Credlin, who are sort of the leading lights, and Paul Murray as well in the last sort of 36 hours. They are the leading cheerleaders of that right-wing conservative media who've all come out and gone, look, the problem was we didn't push hard enough on that right-wing culture war type button. Right? Okay. Try that again next time. Please do it again next time.
I've got to tell you, they've been consistently trying that again for about a decade and a half consistently now. And it's having the exact result that some people, who shall remain nameless, may have strongly warned against back in the day.
But some people who remain nameless because they're on this podcast.
Yeah. Yep. I don't know who that would be. So let me come back to a strategy question for you, Elana. So knowing that we've got to pick up environmentally conscious votes in those teal seats in Sydney and Melbourne and not lose any in places like Brisbane and also Sydney, Melbourne and others, how did the nuclear policy play for you, do you think?
Oh my God. It was...
First move on the chessboard, nuclear policy. The election hasn't even been called yet, but you need environmentally conscious votes. Nuclear. Go. Talk me through it.
Well, nuclear. It's pronounced nuclear.
Well, what we did do, Steve, is that we very quietly took the nuclear policy and we put it in the cupboard and we lead-lined the door and then we bolted the door shut and then we arc-welded it shut and then we never spoke of it until pesky journalists who clearly hate us from the hate media asked us about it.
Yeah. It's a bold strategic move, right? Like before the election's even called.
But God, it just... And the thing was because in the aftermath of the election, the clear thing coming out of that is clearly the nuclear policy was the brainchild of the Nats and David Littleproud. And so it's kind of seen as look what the Nats have done to the Liberal Party. And there was even some talk on Twitter today of the Nats have sacrificed the Liberal Party to maintain their own seats in their own position.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't see any fault in that logic.
Yeah, not really.
Yeah.
No, not a lot. But it did strike me as a bold opening gambit. Let's put it in those terms.
Yeah.
just as a chess move, as a piece of strategy, to then follow it up with because remember, we have a women problem in the Liberal Party, and we've also got a number of seats who are very, very strongly professional women, a lot of whom work from home. All six.
Steve, are you going to bring up working from home?
I am. It just so happens that those 6 seats lost to those community independents have some of the highest rates of working from home in the country. And it also happens that they have some of the highest rates of professional women and women with higher education in the country. So when you come out...
Go back to the office, wouldn't they?
Well, look, or job share, mate.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. Or look, or give up the career and look after the kids. Like, these are all very reasonable options for them. Again, like as one of the first things you roll out as a piece of strategy where you have to win those seats, and you don't have other seats that you can win otherwise that you would make up. So let's say that you've just done the 2 things that will guarantee that you will not win back those 2 seats, those independent seats. I equally don't see at the same time which seats you win with those policies to make up for it.
No,
but I don't think that was about winning seats.
No.
I mean, it was an election campaign, so that's silly of me to think.
Sorry. I don't think that was directly about winning seats. I think that was about donors.
Interesting. Okay, that was about appeasing donors.
I think there are a lot of property owners who have expensive buildings in the CBD that companies are saying, we don't need as much floor space anymore because most of our people work from home.
Yep.
I think there are a lot of business owners who are used to micromanaging their staff or managing their staff just by wandering around instead of having management skill. And they all, or even better, bosses who love an audience. Now, I'm going to be honest. I don't mind an audience.
Sure.
There are people who are desperate for that captive audience constantly. And I think those people, a lot of them are going to functions with senior liberals and complaining about how terrible it is that everyone's working from home and slacking off. Everyone talks about how unproductive people are at home, except productivity went up during the pandemic when everyone was working from home because they weren't driving an hour and a half or taking public transport for an hour and a half to get to work and running around and trying to find space for their kids. And there's all sorts of reasons why working from home is actually a really great thing if you've got some management skills and if you're not a sociopath.
Those are 2 big ifs, though, right?
I think that was really driven by the conversation, and to some extent the nuclear argument was too. And there's probably a couple other things you're going to bring up where they're in a very tight bubble where they hear a lot from like a very narrow group of people, and I think some of that was about we've got all these business people and property owners who are donors who are really upset about this, and they're going to be so thrilled. They're going to throw money at us, and we need that money to contest all these seats that we need to hold and win.
Interesting.
I'm guessing. I'm guessing that was the thing.
Look, it certainly makes more sense than a genuine policy pitch to some winnable seats.
Yeah, for sure.
And because it made no sense from a winning seats perspective, because Dutton has made it very, very clear for the last 3 years that their entire strategy for regaining government was in the outer suburbs. He deliberately abandoned the independent heartland and went, no, we don't need those seats anymore. We will win in the outer suburbs. And guess who really likes working from home? Oh, that would be all the people in the outer suburbs who are really, really happy not to have to commute for an hour and a half each way for a couple of days a week.
Elana, but you know what the problem there is? They don't actually know that many people from the outer suburbs. They assume that they're all tradies and people who work in shops and cleaners and things, and they don't get to work from home, and they're probably annoyed and jealous that some people do.
Yes.
It's the politics of envy, Andre. That's what it is. It's the politics.
It's a fundamental misunderstanding of your electorate.
Yeah.
And they can't deny that there's been a fundamental misunderstanding because you just look at the result.
Yeah.
The result will tell you whether you've understood your electorate or not.
I forget where I read this because, once again, I've read too much and not kept track of my sources. But even the Labor Party campaign was shocked at the backlash to that one. That they knew it would go down like a bucket of cold sick, as Shane Wright from the Age likes to say.
Yep.
But even Labor was shocked by the vehemence with which it was received.
But remember, they're still in a little bit of a bubble, right? Their
Yeah, that's
bubble
true.
is not as enclosed and as exclusive as the Liberal bubble, but there is still a bubble there. It's if you're a federal MP, even a lot of state MPs, it's really hard not to be sucked into that.
To sort of think about it from a campaigning point of view. So from a policy point of view, it was not a good policy. From a campaign strategy point of view, the timing was awful. Like, to start with that, and to start with a policy that was poorly thought through, but then poorly delivered, and then explained in a way that put offside 50% of the population. That's not a great sort of day two of a federal election campaign.
No.
But then they reversed course.
Well, yeah,
they then went back on it.
Yeah, well,
and that's what people love in an election campaign, an immediate 180-degree turn.
Yeah. Actually, it turns out that was a bad idea. And I heard somebody, sorry, Elana, try to spin it as, but isn't that what we want from politicians, to take feedback and change policy based on the feedback of the electorate? Like, sure.
Yeah.
But normally we want that process to happen before you announce policy in the first place.
Exactly.
Preferably.
Because
it happens from time to time.
It does happen.
You throw some food out and you see who licks it up, and it turns out no one is, and you go, whoops, sorry about that. And, Bob Carr was the grand master of the apology, the attack apology, and allowing you to get another term. And, it can really work. But the problem is they didn't really apologise for it.
No.
And probably if Dutton had come out and said, oh, look, we got it wrong, blah, 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 it might have shown a bit of... But instead he sent out poor... I can't remember her name.
Oh, Jane Hume.
Jane Hume. Sent her out to sort of like fumble and mumble her way through, and it just looked like he was throwing her under the bus. Like, it just... Nothing was handled well.
No.
And it showed that they've got a B team behind the scenes. They've got a B team on the front bench. It's just...
It was very generous to say it's even a B team.
Well...
Because look, as a woman who works from home, and I'm in the incredibly privileged position that I work from home full time, because post-pandemic my employer embraced finding talent where I could get it. And I don't have caring responsibilities. As regular listeners to the podcast will know that I'm a single mother to 2 cats.
You have cats, that counts.
That's true, yes. But
I wish I could get my kids to poo in a box. Anyway.
But I have to admit, like, when Dutton announced that thing, and the female press gallery journalist very rightly just went, what about women who work from home and who have caring responsibilities and yada, yada, yada? And without batting an eyelid, he said, well, they can job share.
Yeah.
If I had been eating Wheaties at that moment, I would have spat them out, because...
Absolutely.
When I heard it, I thought I was having a stroke. I thought that I was absolutely hallucinating that, because I could not believe that in 2025, even a Liberal opposition leader in this day and age would have come up with that. And lo and behold, he did. That absolutely astounded me.
They tell on themselves, Elana. It's like Tony Abbott with, the women of Australia when they're doing their ironing.
Yes. Wanting the carbon price to be revealed so they can iron for cheaper.
Yeah. People tell on themselves, particularly, this is why staffers hate it when members of parliament go off script or say, I don't need the briefing, or I know what I'm doing.
No.
Because
I've got this.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on them. It depends
on
the member of parliament.
Some do. Yeah.
But
absolutely,
some of these people have really, really outdated views that just don't match up with what a modern community expects. And let me tell you, younger people who now outnumber the boomers I mean, those of us who may or may not be Gen X are, of course, skipped over as per usual. But
Mm-hmm.
the millennials and younger, they're a bigger cohort than the boomers now. And I think we're seeing that writ large.
Oh, yeah.
Let me ask one last question around sort of the way in which the campaign rolled out the Liberal Party. And I think it would be fair to ask some questions about the Labor Party at some point. But Peter Dutton needed a pretty strong reset after Easter and after the Anzac Day sort of long weekends, school holidays. Things were not looking good coming into the last week of the campaign. Pope passing away, all of that kind of good stuff that created an opportunity, a nice little, let's take a breath and let's come out with something for the final week and a bit that really sort of drives home and reminds everybody what the Liberal Party stands for, what you're going to get, who we represent as a party, and what we want for this nation, what our ambition is, the big idea that you can, and we got a 25% cut in the fuel price.
A temporary
25. Sorry, a 12-month 25-cent cut to the fuel price.
But that means you've got to go without your permanent tax cut. Income tax cut.
Yeah.
So really, it's a good deal for most people.
I mean, that was an awesome, response to the budget.
I'll admit to being underwhelmed. I do keep an eye out for a bargain at the petrol pump. I thought visiting 17 petrol stations in the last week of the campaign was potentially overdone, although they were trying to drive home a message that we are the party of discounted fuel. And do you think?
No. Well, what astounded me about that strategy was that he made the fuel excise announcement, and then I think it was a journalist who said, "How about you visit a petrol station?" And then off he went to do it. And
great idea. I'm going to keep doing it all week.
Yeah.
But you know what? The thing is, once they flip-flop on the working from home policy and everyone could keep working from home, they weren't that worried about the petrol prices.
No.
They should have, if they'd kept the return to the office policy,
then done the petrol thing,
it might have worked. But they got it the wrong way around.
Yeah.
Oh, look, I think they were just grasping for any straw that they could get.
Election campaigns are fascinating in how they reveal things.
Yeah.
And what has been astonishing to me is the way the media now in the post-mortem are going, did you guys notice that the Liberal Party are really shit?
Yeah.
And they have no policies.
They're not very good at this.
And they're not very good at this. Like, I mean, this has been an ongoing, Steve and I, you have been talking about this for the last 3 years and possibly longer. Mm-hmm. And Andre, you and I off mic as well. What amazed me was just how revealing this campaign was for the absolute lack of talent, the incompetence, I was chatting to some volunteers at the election booth I was at on election day, because we were sort of despairing over the fact that we felt that Albanese would get a majority, which meant that we would continue to get more of the same, and he would not be sort of pushed into being more courageous by a minority government at a crossbench. And this person said to me, like, why are the Libs so shit? And I said, it's because the depth of their talent is like puddle deep. It is that they have no... Yeah. And they were talking about how awful Dutton is. I said, yes, but he's the best of them. And they were like, the look on their face was just... And this has been so revealing for that. And it's not even just the parliamentary crew are terrible. Clearly, there was nobody left in the background, and there was no power left behind the throne either.
No, the party machine has been destroyed and is terribly funded now because they just can't get donors.
Yep. And volunteers from the looks of things.
Yeah.
I think, like, if you look at that last week, I think there was one last... And bearing in mind that by the last week, a few million people had already voted. So you've already lost the opportunity to convince significant numbers of people. And as much as early voting tends to favour the Libs anyway, fine. But you're missing out a lot on your opportunity to actually fund people. So we got, on the Wednesday, we got the new CPI figures. Inflation came in again at 2.4. The annual trend mean came in at 2.9, which meant no matter which way you sliced it, CPI was within the RBA's target band. Everything that happened the following day when Taylor and Hume gave their budget and their costings and the rest of it. And their key thing was that under the Liberal Party, we'll get inflation back under control, which they kept repeating. And I was very happy that one of the journalists, one of the first questions they got at that press conference was, well, inflation's 2.4%. So
how much more under control do you want it to be?
Already under control, basically. Like, isn't it already low? Isn't it already back where it needs to be? And the answer was, like sort of fluff and hand waving and no, we're better economic managers. So they kind of lost any last hope to make a splash with that economic, I'm going to call it an economic plan because it had numbers in it. But the idea that there was some substance to that it had been.
There's a lotto ticket, Steve.
Yeah, I know. And look, a lotto ticket has about as much chance of delivering the outcomes that you espouse to it as that plan does. Like, there was nothing in there that you would actually give credence to. Not really.
No, there was nothing. It was an embarrassment. But I think Elana's heard me espouse this theory before, and I'll run it out here. And that is that Australians actually like boring, predictable politicians.
Interesting. Okay.
They don't like flash. That doesn't appeal to them. Yep. What they want is someone that they don't have to think about very much. And if you look back over time, I think the only possible exception to that rule was Bob Hawke. Even he was, you kind of knew what Bob Hawke thought about things. You were never really surprised by it. And I mean, I think that was John Howard's key to success, was whether you liked him or you didn't, you kind of knew what you were getting and you knew what he was going to say before he said it. And we haven't had that for a while. I think the combination of Dutton just coming out with some just absolutely bonkers policies and then flipping backwards and forwards on some of them, and then coming up with new ones out of nowhere, and as much as they try to deny it, they're very clear attempt to hook their wagon train to the Trump phenomenon in the early days, and then the ensuing chaos that came from Trump. All of those things made Peter Dutton and the Liberal Party the wacky, uncertain, unstable option.
Yes.
And Albanese, who's been, frankly, pretty consistent over his entire parliamentary career, and during the campaign was he was remarkably consistent.
Yes.
And frankly, he personally, I mean, the Labor government's had their ups and downs, and they're not perfect by any stretch.
No.
They have been, by and large, pretty stable and pretty predictable. And probably the most stable first-term government that we've had, probably since Hawke.
So no changes to the front bench that I can think of. I think everyone who was sworn in on day one is still in their same portfolio.
Yeah.
And as you say, Andre, sort of like it or not, and I certainly have my criticisms of Labor's first term, but every one of those front benches was in the media, pretty much. Like, we got to hear from all of them. Some of them stayed a little closer to home than others, but we got to hear from all of them. We heard from Miles, and we heard from Chalmers, and we heard from Plibersek, and we heard from Wong, and we heard from Gallagher, and we heard from Albanese, obviously. None of them fucked up. None of them said dumb shit. Albanese was sort of nudged and stumbled off the back of a stage one time. That was the highlight of, or the low light of the campaign in terms of what went wrong. The rest of it was really just boringly solid.
Yep.
That only became an issue because he at first denied that he'd fallen over.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. When in doubt, lie. But, I mean, really, if you think about the first term of the Albanese government, the voice did not go well.
No.
And I think, and we've talked about this before, Elana, but I think the government mishandled their involvement in the campaign. They were not involved enough, and they weren't involved early enough. And I think the Yes campaign itself was too diffuse and not sufficiently concentrated behind one or two key spokespeople, but which is why No was successful. Anyway, that's a matter for a podcast that's probably already been and gone. And the only other big issue really was Albo buying a house, which was bad optics, But I think most people are like, well, he split up with his ex. He's got a new fiance and they bought a house. Nobody thought he was a pauper.
Anyway,
and
no.
he got a hammering for it. And
He
he
did.
probably deserved it. But I think in the end, people went, and moved on from that. So, I mean, when you think about it, Howard's first term was chaos. And they lost the popular vote in '98. And then who do we have after that? A Rudd's first term, ugh.
Yeah,
Gillard's
that didn't end
first
well.
term, ugh. Abbott's first term, ugh.
Awful.
Turnbull, ugh.
Yeah.
Morrison, ugh. Like, has anyone had since Hawke? No one's had a good, stable first term, and Albanese delivered that. And frankly, the Labor Party as a whole delivered that. They've kept their instinct to factionally infight under control. So, it buys into my little theory, which is Australians like the boring, predictable candidate. And I think this time around, that was definitely Albanese in a way that Shorten never was.
Yeah.
True. And in the way that Abbott could only succeed because of the chaos of Rudd, Gillard, Rudd. That's what allowed Tony Abbott to not be the unstable, uncertain, unpredictable candidate. These things are what buy into that. But
and look, the other thing that Abbott was able to do that a lot of other politicians would struggle to do is sit there and just be obstinately opposed to everything in a childlike manner. I know you are, but what am I? I know you are, but what am I? I know
he's uniquely
based
to that approach.
His capacity to just be annoying and childlike persistently for years was successful. Got him over the line, right? In a way that I couldn't maintain that kind of stupidity for long enough to succeed with that kind of thing, right? I'm not. Yeah. But he sort of lacks, I guess, the intellectual capacity to get bored with things easily.
Before we move on to the Labor Party, I want to get a quote from Cos Samaras, who's one of the Redbridge dudes. And I think he's summed up the Liberal campaign beautifully and savagely. So this is a tweet. He says, "We don't conduct polling for any political party. Our role is to objectively conduct research, analyse and comment on data, either ours or others. But when the numbers lean heavily in one direction, it's hard not to sound partisan just by reporting the facts. For the past 2 months, polling has clearly favoured Labor. Why? I could give you the technical explanation, but it's a long weekend. Let's just say this. Labor braced for a full-blown armoured cavalry charge. What emerged instead was a lone rider on a pony wearing pyjamas. That's how underwhelming the coalition campaign has been." He's not wrong.
Yeah, well.
Because actually, before we move on to Labor, sorry, one more question. At which point in the campaign did you know that Peter Dutton had lost it and was never going to recover, was never going to have any chance of getting within cooee of even minority government?
I never thought he had a chance, honestly. Okay. I kept waiting for the moment where he would bring himself into contention, and it never happened.
Never happened.
He just kept pushing himself further out.
There were a few points during the campaign when he clearly had an opportunity to come out strongly, right? Where you would sort of look at what he was doing and say, okay, the camera, the attention of the nation is on you. You've got the stage. Make yourself heard, make an impact, make the case for leadership, make the case for the Liberal Party to be back in government, that this is not a return to the stupidity and corruption of the Morrison government and whatever that case might be. But very early on in the campaign, he had that opportunity. And to Andre's point, it never eventuated.
Yeah.
And there were plenty of opportunities for them to reset, for them to look at what they were doing and go, okay, let's put the weekend behind us. Let's put last weekend. Week 1 was not our best. Let's make week 2 a winner. The thing you see in football teams when they lose the first quarter, they go in at quarter time and they say, let's win the second quarter, right? We might be well behind. We may have had a terrible first quarter and we're down by 8 goals or 10 goals or whatever it might be, but let's at least win the next quarter, right? We're not going to win the game this quarter, but let's at least win the quarter, right? And I never saw that determination from them.
Mm.
You never got the sense of, we're going to make today a winner for us. And I can't think of an individual day during the 35 days of the campaign, even when they had debates and whatever else was going on, there was never a day when I went to bed and thought, wow, the coalition had a good day.
No. I fall probably halfway between you two, and then I'm with you, Andre. I never saw a pathway to victory for the coalition in the lead up to the campaign. Like, the maths just never added up for me. And even Tony Barry on the Back to Back Barry's podcast said the same thing. He says the maths, like the seat math, just never added up for him. Certainly not for majority, and definitely not for minority government. But for me, it was at the end of the first week, I sat back and went, Dutton has completely and utterly fucked this. Like, he's not even going to be competitive. Like, he's not even going to have a reasonable showing and set himself up for a two-term strategy. And at the end of the second week, I was like, he's going to be lucky to remain opposition leader at the end of this. And weirdly, look, it's not often I'm right, because I, again, famously thought that Kamala Harris would win. But wow, did I get proven right on Peter Dutton?
Yeah, you got this one really right. Like, you were really right on this one.
I made up for Kamala.
Do you know what? I don't blame anyone here in Australia for thinking that Kamala Harris was going to win, because sensible people looked at that contest and just went, how could it go any other way? And we forgot to factor in America. That's what we forgot.
That's exactly right. I even had a friend in America, in the Ohio of all places, who, again, his fatal flaw was that he was also a sensible person. And, we now have a podcast in which we are both very, very sensible and very, very wrong. So
yeah. I think one thing, and I mean, we haven't talked much about Labor's campaign, but that's because they were just really disciplined. They were on message.
Yes.
As you said, Steve, we heard from all the major players, but they were all in concert. They were all on message. They were disciplined. Their candidates were disciplined.
I was just thinking that. Yeah. And they didn't have to disendorse any of them. There were no comparisons, like none of that kind of thing. It didn't turn out that one of them secretly had, a swastika tattooed on his ass or any of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
As the Liberals did.
Yeah, well, some of them weren't secret. One thing that I also took away from this was I felt like the media did not do a great job of covering that campaign. I think they portrayed it as this neck-and-neck battle, and the electorate saw it for what it was. They saw that one side was running a sharp, well-structured, policy-filled campaign that was executed well, and the other side was not in any way, shape, or form.
At all.
And the electorate saw that. The media must have seen it. But I can't tell whether it's because, a lot of them are working for people who really, really love the Liberal Party. Watching journos tie themselves in knots to either say that Dutton had won debates or it was neck and neck and you couldn't put a cigarette paper between them. And
you're embarrassing yourself.
I will out myself. I'm a former long-term member of the Liberal Party. A former, holy moly. And I just sat there every time going, well, Dutton just dumped that in the bin every time. And then I would hear, people tie themselves in knots to try and say how it was, it's hard to see who was the winner from that. So, really? And I think the public saw the winner. Maybe not so much the journos, but I think some of the owners of the media outlets. They think that most people don't watch the debates, so they're just going to read the headlines or see the news report. So if we just say that Peter Dutton's doing well, then people will think that. I think what they forgot was they're called legacy media for a reason. That the people watching TV news and the people reading the newspaper, whether that's a physical newspaper or online, they're not most people under the age of 50.
No,
and so they were influencing some of the population, but I think it was the part of the population more likely to vote Liberal anyway. And I think other people were getting their information from elsewhere, and they were getting it in a much more, direct and honest way, and they made use of it. And I think there's some troubling signs there for the media. They really need to start abandoning the sort of false equality, or equal time. We've now got the opposition party looks like it's going to be less than a third of the parliament. strangely, Anthony Albanese is going to find himself in, at the start of his second term, in the place that John Howard was in 2004. He'd won a thumping victory, had a massive, massive backbench. 2004. And that's when he went bonkers, because he had a majority in the Senate, and it was actually the Liberal backbench that became the opposition. So there's going to be a real challenge there for Labor in this next term of government to manage the huge parliamentary party. But you know what? They've got some good examples of it. The McGowan and Cook governments have managed that and managed it quite well. And that's where, so all this was me coming back to something that I think you said, Steve, or maybe it was you, Elana, but you agreed with each other anyway, that the concern was that with such a large majority, there might be a sense that there won't be that crossbench or the Greens or whoever to push Albanese to be a bit bold. And I actually wonder whether it might have the opposite effect, that he will now be so secure in his position that sort of the centre-right factions are not going to have much sway over him, which I think they have. We've seen the residue of his ongoing battle with Bill Shorten. Bill Shorten's exited the parliament. You know, Richard Marles is from the other right. There's the Shorten right and the non-Shorten right. And, you know, Marles is from the other right. And I think we've seen some policy decisions like AUKUS and other things that really were part of that internal factional dynamic. And I do wonder now whether Albanese will have sufficient personal sort of mandate and power, and as John Howard did at one point, you know, a very grateful army of backbenchers who are like, oh, thank you for keeping our seats and helping me win for the first time when I didn't think I would, that he might actually find that he can be a bit more bold.
Yeah.
But it's just whether he will do that in a way that secures his next term, or whether he'll let it get to his head and do a John Howard after 2004 and do the equivalent of work choices and blow it all up.
Yeah, because when I was thinking during the campaign that we're now looking at a Labor majority, I was thinking that he would stumble over the line with 77, 78 seats, similar to the parliament that's just ended, and the status quo would be maintained. But the crushing size of this victory, I mean, and to be fair to Albanese, it wasn't just Trump, it wasn't just Dutton's incompetence, much as those two things did contribute enormously. This is as much his victory as it is Dutton's loss. And there's been a number of reports on this. He came into 2025 in January with a clear plan and a clear strategy, and he executed that flawlessly and somehow managed to keep his party together and the factions under control long enough to execute that strategy through the campaign, and now he's been rewarded for it. And so he always likes to say that he is underestimated, and I think in this instance he's actually right. The whole country underestimated him, and particularly the media. And so my concern was that if he fell over the line with 76, 78 seats, he would learn the wrong lessons from that victory, and we'd have another 3 years of the status quo. And this incrementalism and this sort of reaching across the aisle for bipartisanship that's never going to come, and forces him to compromise in ways that has driven the electorate completely insane. I mean, he might even end up with 90 seats at the way things are going.
Easily could.
Yeah.
He easily could.
Which is territory not seen, as you said, Andre, since John Howard in 2004. And I do wonder if that will unleash Albo, and he might choose to be brave. But I think cautiously brave, if that's not an oxymoron, where I think the lesson that they have learned, potentially to their detriment in the first term, was not doing anything that they had not taken to an election and promised the electorate. And I think this term might be a little bit of that, but I do think there's going to be a lot of sort of foundation building in this election, this term. So we won't get the big transformative Bog Hawke and Keating style reforms that I think the electorate is desperate for. But I think the foundation stones and the arguments for those reforms will be built over the next 3 years to then be implemented in the third term, which I think is going to be inevitable, because the Liberal Party now is at the raise it to the ground, salt the earth and start again level of party rebuilding. And that's only if cooler heads prevail and they don't convince themselves that what they really need to do is move further to the right, which they're already in the process of convincing themselves they need to do. So the polling, and it's really quite funny, the polling, nobody's talking about the fact that the polling kind of got it wrong again. The polls really underestimated Labor's performance. I think they overestimated the coalition's appeal. And I kind of feel for the pollsters in this respect, because at the beginning of the year, Dutton did look competitive. And the sudden reversal and the sudden, and you see it in sort of the tracking polls where it's Liberal above Labor for ages, and then it's almost like a DNA thingy where it just, this is a terrible thingy for an audio, but it's literally just swaps almost overnight. It's bizarre. I'll try and find a graphic and whack it into the show notes. But so I can understand pollsters going, that's a bit weird. Let's correct for that. But except for YouGov, and YouGov deserve all the kudos because their final MRP, I think the night before the actual election day, was pretty much on the money. And my mate Damo sent me a graphic of it. And this is what he said. So he said, so this is shit. This is giving huge big politics vibes. Labor are being rewarded because the LNP are so fucking hopeless, not because they're doing anything right. For the government to function properly, there needs to be a competent and viable opposition, no matter how vile I think they are. And I looked at that MRP and just went, there's no way that's going to happen. That's completely overstated. What is YouGov sniffing? And I need to apologise to YouGov because it turned out they were smack on the money. Close. In fact, even they underestimated the result.
Yeah. I think just talking about that opposition or lack thereof, I think the only real opposition we're going to end up with is the Greens in the Senate.
Yep.
That will be the only real effective opposition. They'll certainly act like it because you're going to have a block of sort of 27, 28 Liberal National senators who will just vote no to everything. You can't really expect any constructive sort of work from them. They will be opposed but not be in opposition. And then that sort of leaves then the Greens with a really important role with such a strong majority in the lower house. They will be required in order for legislation to pass.
Yep.
And they will need to do it in a way that doesn't feel like extortion.
Yes. Let's talk about the Greens because they did not have a good night on Saturday night. And also...
At least not the one they were hoping for, Elana. Yeah.
No. I mean, at the time of recording, Adam Bandt's seat is still very much up on a knife edge. It's entirely possible that Albanese will take out two party leaders in this election, which is another historical achievement that no one else has ever managed to achieve. As far as I'm aware, I might need to go and fact check myself on that one, but certainly not within living memory. So that's extraordinary unto itself. Look, I think I spoke to both of you off mic over the last 3 years, talking about the fact that I felt that the result in 2022 for the Greens was their high watermark. And I did not expect them to build on that or replicate that in 2025. But it was an instinctive thingy that they would have a challenge to hold on to those seats in Queensland. And mostly because the political environment is moving so rapidly at the moment. At the moment, nothing is certain for anybody, as we've just discovered. And now the Greens are staring down the possibility of losing all 4 of their lower house seats, including their leader. And on top of that, the flip side of that, they have now been thrust in the position of actually holding the balance of power in the Senate for realsies. I think it's going to be a massive challenge for the Greens because I think part of the reason why they have not done well in this particular election partially is the resurgence of Labor. So they didn't get a lot of Labor preferences. That's how they lost the Queensland seats, is that Labor ended up in front in the 3-party... So the 3 candidate preferred count, which meant that the Greens could not win on Labor preferences. Labor won on their preferences. And I think that was in part, they were punished for the perception that they were being obstructionist and blocking things in the Senate.
Yeah, but blocking reasonable policy because it didn't go as far as they wanted it to, but then inadvertently supporting a much worse status quo.
Exactly.
It,
Yes.
it's really hard to justify that to the electorate.
I believe that the Greens will do better holding the balance of power in the Senate if Adam Bandt loses his seat and is no longer the parliamentary leader.
I agree.
I agree.
I think the people that they have in the Senate are much more likely to work productively and constructively with the Labor Party in the Senate than they would with Bandt still in charge of the party overall. That's my feeling.
Yeah.
I think he sets the wrong tone when it comes to negotiations. He has a tendency to put Labor offside with his media appearances publicly, whatever he's like privately with them. He seems to put them offside ahead of negotiations. It's clearly a negotiating tactic, but it's one that seems to work against them rather than in their favour. I think the people that they have in the Senate, Faruqi, Pocock and others, will be much more constructive in that role without his interference and without him setting the negotiating landscape. That's my view. At the moment, he's behind. There was a significant swing against him in Melbourne. Labor is ahead on the count with sort of 2/3, 70% of votes counted. He's well and truly in danger of losing that seat.
And that's fascinating into itself because he won that on primary in 2022.
Last time.
So to have that bigger swing against him, to the point, the fact is that if he does manage to hold on, it'll be by the slimmest of margins and it will be on preferences, is an astonishing turnaround in 3 years. And I think it is a reflection of the public's running out of patience with that particular negotiating tactic.
Look,
That was
it's one
exemplified.
thing to obstruct Morrison. It's one thing to be obstructive to Morrison and to be obstructive to clearly conservative, right-wing, destroying the environment type policies. It's another thing to hold up billions of dollars in social housing funding. And look, I have my criticisms of the housing fund and the way it was being spent and all of it. But to be seen to be obstructing social housing because the policy's not good enough really, really doesn't play well. It really doesn't play well.
No, I think that they have been punished by the electorate for that. So when I was on pre-poll, there were Greens volunteers and things, and I had a lovely time with a lovely lady called Robin on pre-poll. But when I was at my polling day booth, I bumped into a different Greens volunteer, and she was on pre-poll with me, but I never really got a chance to speak to her. But we recognised each other and had a bit of a chat. And she said to me, "Oh gosh, pre-poll was so tough." She said, "I copped abuse every single day for those 2 weeks." And I was shocked because my pre-poll experience as a Democrat, totally different. I copped zero abuse. I had people who were thrilled to see me, at best. I mean, my absolute highlight of pre-poll was the final day when I bumped into I had this lovely older lady sidle up to me, and because I had a Keep the Bastards Honest t-shirt on, and she said, "I set up the very first WA branch of the Australian Democrats back in," she goes, "Oh, it was 77 or 78, I can't remember which." And I had lost my mind, imagine. So we had and the queue at that stage was taking forever because it was the demand on the final day pre-poll was just insane. We had a queue up the street from 8:30 in the morning until 6 p.m. that night. It was absolutely mental.
Yeah, wow.
So we had a lovely time chatting to each other as she inched along in the queue. And she was telling me how she was protesting uranium mining in the 70s, and now she's protesting fracking in the Kimberley in now, and she's furious that she has to protest this stuff at all. So that was my pre-poll experience. It was wonderful. At work, the worst thing that happened was that people had no idea who the Democrats were. But that gave us an opportunity to have a chat about it. But the Greens, and a friend of mine was volunteering for us in Woodvale, and she said that, and she felt terrible. She said, this poor kid who's volunteering for the Greens, she said, "I've seen the public abuse him 3 times in the 3 hours that I've been here so far." And another Greens volunteer at my booth mentioned that they had copped abuse both on the day and in pre-poll. And that was amazing to me. Just judging by the number of people who are taking Greens out of votes, I did not expect them to be having much of an issue at all. But there's clearly been a pattern of people blaming the Greens for something and seeing them as obstructionists and seeing them as not being very happy with them. Let me put it that way. So I find the prospect of them holding balance of power in the Senate super fascinating, because I think the next 3 years, like if it all comes to pass, I think the next 3 years will make or break them as a political force. And I think if Adam Banter retains his seat and stays in charge, it might actually break them, because Andre has a theory about the Greens and holding balance of power that I'll hand over to you. As a former Liberal staffer who has worked worked for senators
worked for a couple of senators.
Yep.
I think the thing is, the Greens are all about activism and to some extent purity of position. They stand on principle. And this is where they come to, where they oppose the CPRS or the housing fund. They're like, no, it's not good enough, so we will stop it until it's perfect.
Yep.
And that appeals to part of their key membership.
Yes.
But I think their voting group has become much broader than that.
Yes.
And that's where they've got to be careful. I think that in order for them to maintain their broader voting group and see more success and growth as a party, they need to be able to learn how to compromise.
Yeah.
However, in compromising, they will not meet the principled requirements of some of their core membership. And I think, Adam Bandt is a prime example of the kind of person who wants to stand on like absolute principle. Fortunately, when you're in that balance of power, and look, we Democrats have experienced this to our extraordinary detriment.
Yep.
You have to be willing to make the right decision to lean towards the greater good, even if that is going to lead to your destruction. And I think that the Greens are going to struggle with that. And I think their instinct will be to not compromise, and that will result in them losing, because I think the Labor Party will exploit that. I think the Labor Party have tried to exploit that at this election. I've heard more anti-Greens talk from the Labor Party in this election than I think I've heard in quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's because they're starting to see an opportunity here to regain some of those people. So it'll just be interesting to see. But I do think that their instinct to be activist and not compromise is going to make having the balance of power in the Senate a real struggle for them.
That position is good for fundraising and bad for broad appeal.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. Like, that is a tension that they're going to struggle to navigate, because a lot of what they've done over the years, to my mind, has been stunts aimed at driving fundraising rather than achieving policy outcomes.
Yep.
Yeah. I've always sort of argued that the Greens in reality don't want to do much better. They might say they do, but if they're in their heart of hearts, the sitting members and the senators would really need to be sitting there going, oh, we don't want to have too many people in Parliament, because then we'll have to make real decisions. We'll have to make real choices.
Yeah.
They're just not fundamentally suited to it. They're either going to lose some of that sort of extended broad appeal that they've started to get, particularly amongst younger voters. For younger people, they tend to be just the standard alternative.
Yes.
Frankly. Most people sort of under 35 that I speak to, they just sort of go, oh, yeah, well, we vote Green.
Because who else
and it's almost like a matter-of-fact thing. Like, well, of course, who else would we vote for? So I think, but even that, as people get a bit older, their priorities change. And, anyway, I do think it will be a challenge for them. I agree with you, though. If Bandt is there, it will be an almost impossible challenge. If he's gone, they might just navigate their way through.
Yeah. Because, Barbara Pocock used to be a Democrat staffer. So, Lynn mentioned it to me. So I think it was during the period when Barbara Pocock was working with somebody on an issue, and I remember her just sitting in Senate estimates just eviscerating somebody over whatever it was. It was, oh God. So my brain is so fried after a 5-week election campaign, I can't remember who I am, never mind something Barbara was doing 2 years ago. It wasn't Robodebt, it was something similar though. Hi guys, editing Elana back again. The issue that Barbara Pocock was eviscerating somebody about was the PricewaterhouseCoopers tax scandal. If you recall, it was where they did work for the government to close international tax loopholes and then proceeded to go and on sell that inside information to the multinational companies who were also their clients in order to then avoid falling foul of the tax loopholes that had just been closed. And so they could continue to avoid paying tax in Australia. And I remembered watching this in Senate estimates at the time, and I said to National President Len Ellison, as I was watching Barbara Pocock ripping, I think, a PwC executive to pieces, she looked and sounded like a Democrat. It's the kind of stuff that Lynn and Lynn's colleagues used to do back in the day. And Lynn just said very dryly, well, she used to be a staffer. So there you go. Anyway, and I remember, talking about it with Lynn, and Lynn went, "Oh yeah, she used to be. I can't remember whose staffer she was, but she was a staffer." And I think after the demise of the Democrats, she obviously joined the Greens and became a senator herself. So she, at least, I think, has the corporate memory of the demise of the Democrats to guide her.
And what the work is, right?
Exactly. And what the work is, what it means to compromise properly. Because I think and look, I say this as someone who has voted for the Greens, particularly in the lower house. It wasn't until I joined the Democrats and realised that Democrats still existed that I realised I had an option in the upper house to vote for. And I think they have a big sort of albatross around their neck in terms of their culture. And it's because they were born out of an activist movement. And so culturally, they are not well suited to compromise and negotiate and accept that something will do for now, and then they can build upon that and keep working constructively with the government of the day to achieve the long-term outcome. And part of working constructively with the government of the day is actually building trust and building relationships and coming to an agreement between the pair of you that at the end of the day, we all want the best thing for the country. And it's just a matter of negotiating on how we deliver that. And that, I think, was the great strength of the Democrats. And culturally, the Democrats were more suited to that because we were never an activist party. We were born out of the sense that neither of the two major parties back in the 1970s were actually talking to or representing the people of Australia, and a third force was required. And I think that was sort of the secret to our success was being that group in the middle that, regardless of who was in government, looked at the legislation presented to the Senate and went, how can we make this better? How can we work with you to amend your legislation to ensure it delivers the outcomes you say you want to achieve?
Yeah.
And the Greens don't have that. They don't have that corporate memory. They don't have that instinct as a party because they were born from a protest movement. And I don't say that in with any kind of hope that the Greens, suffer a demise. I think there's a very strong need for a protest-oriented party and an activist-oriented party in the parliament, because you need that perspective. You need that issues-based, dare I say it, bleeding heart, compassionate aspect in Parliament to fight for the marginalised, to fight for the very, very difficult and politically ugly things like the genocide in Gaza. But therefore, that also does not set you up well to be a party of negotiation and compromise and finding a pragmatic, functional solution that achieves an outcome. And I think that's the terrible sort of knife edge that they're teetering on. Since the demise of the Democrats, they've spent the last 15, 18 years expanding to fill the space that we left, and then broadening their appeal. And they're going through a terrible sort of birthing pain at the moment of trying to move from the historical roots of being a party of protest to being a mainstream political movement that does have broad appeal and can negotiate on complex issues and can achieve pragmatic outcomes that serves the nation's interests. And they're in serious danger of being ripped apart by that. And I don't want that to happen to them, but I fear that it will. And I think particularly because they have done themselves no favours with the ALP. I mean, Andre, you can speak to this probably better than I can, but I strongly suspect that the two majors, Labor and Liberal, perfectly comfortable, perfectly happy with the two-party system, and they will work to shore that up at the expense of the Greens.
Oh, yeah.
If push comes to shove.
Yeah. The Liberal Party is always happy to shore up the two-party system at the expense of the National Party too. You know, like the only people that the Liberal Party hates more than the Labor Party are the National Party. I mean, and that's why you do see the collusion when it comes to political donations, members' entitlements, all sorts of electoral issues, pay for members of parliament. You know, you just see them in lockstep on these issues because, you know, they know what side their bread's buttered on. You know, somebody on the weekend was saying, oh, you know, in New Zealand, they don't have all this signage everywhere and they don't have volunteers everywhere and the how to vote cards are just in the polling booth and you're not allowed to do any campaigning on election day. I'm like, yeah, but the Liberal Party and the Labor Party are convinced that their advantage is their vast army of volunteers.
Sure.
And they think, and that's their way of keeping everyone else out.
Mm.
You know, and so while they have that advantage, they're not going to give it up. You dance with the one that brung you. And so, you know, we're just not going to see those sorts of reforms while it's advantageous for the two of them to duke it out between them. You might, I mean, if the Liberal Party keeps going the way it's going, they might start siding with the Greens or something. I don't know. They might start looking at ways of getting back some advantage. But
a new coalition partner.
Yeah. I
Bring
mean,
the Greens into the coalition.
That'd be hilarious. I always say though that politics is not a straight line; it's a horseshoe, and you go far enough left, you come out on the right. You know,
There you go.
But
a Nats Green Alliance.
Yeah. Jeez.
Sorry.
But
oh goodness!
As a reformed former Liberal who's seen this from the other side and seen it from the inside of the Liberal Party, this is the chickens are coming home to roost now at the federal level that started to, in WA at least, come home to roost a while ago. And I think it's, you know, we're seeing it in some of the other states as well, where they really did, and you just have to read about Alex Antic and some of the activity in the Victorian Liberal Party and New South Wales. And they have subbed out a lot of the work of membership to select church groups. And they're having an influence on candidates and policy, and that influence is out of step with the vast majority of the community. And, you know, we're seeing the effects of that. You know, we talk about that lack of talent, and there have been very good people in the Liberal Party. I mean,
yes,
some people may not believe that, but there have been very good people in the Liberal Party, and there have been good members of Parliament and good senators. And I'm proud to have worked for some of the people I've worked for. Not all of them, but some of them. But I think that those people are not being replaced with quality candidates, quality members, and that trend is only going to go one way. And unless somebody really makes a change, and I just don't see how that's going to happen, because the moderates have either abandoned the party or been shunted out, and hopefully more of them make their way over to us here at the Democrats. But I do think that we are seeing demographics catch up with the Liberal Party big time.
So just one final thought that I've just realised I forgot to add in earlier. So in WA, I think also one of the chickens that is coming home to roost is like the world after the pandemic. Not that the pandemic is technically finished, but you know what I mean. Like there was a real sliding doors moment in 2020. The WA election in 2021 could have been put down to Mark McGowan's response to the pandemic, which I think in large part it was. But I think the 2025 state election was... and Roger Cook's result was in some ways almost like a bellwether for the federal election. So in the lead up to the state election, the WA state president, Lisa Griffiths, and I were at a festival in Hyde Park. And this was literally a week before the WA election. And we had people coming up to us, seeking us out to chat about politics, which was unusual and deeply gratifying. But the vibe we were getting from people at that moment was... anyone but Labor, but definitely not the Liberals.
Interesting.
You know? And I think that was reflected in the WA state election with the Liberals did claw back a few seats, because considering that they couldn't lose any more than they already had, but Labor retained its crushing majority in the lower house. Thankfully, I think has lost its majority in the upper house. And then that has then weirdly flowed through into the federal election, which I don't think anybody was anticipating. And as Andre was saying earlier, WA used to be a Liberal stronghold, and that has really flipped post 2020. Now, where WA goes, it seems that the rest of the nation follows. So, the next 4 years is going to be fascinating.
Not sure how Steve will react to that.
Oh, look, I mean, to what I've been seeing on the East Coast is essentially some real dysfunction settling into the New South Wales Liberal Party in particular. I've seen it at the state elections, the last two, with their pre-selection process, their inability to get candidates nominated, their inability to do that for the local elections, the impact of factional infighting on that process, the way in which pre-selection battles have been fought, the way in which they have been overruled or sort of gamed for internal factional favours and this kind of thing, and how that's then flowed into the national party machinery. But just looking at it over the last probably 10 years in New South Wales, it's been quite apparent that they have been increasingly dysfunctional. Now, a party of government needs to have a party machinery that is functional. That needs to happen both at an administrative level, but also at a policy and research level. And you've just not been seeing quality in either sphere. Then they're not choosing good candidates. They don't seem to have the depth of candidate to choose from in the first place. They keep parachuting people into electorates where they don't live, which is never a good idea. Like, you do that as a last resort only. Yep. You don't do that as a matter of course. It has a tendency to piss off the electorate. They've been overriding the branches and the way those votes have happened in pre-selection processes. All of this kind of thing has been going on for a number of years, and it's just a sign of that dysfunction within the party. And you can see it now when you look at the national leadership and that national tier of, like, we're having this conversation at the moment of who will replace Peter Dutton as leader of the opposition and leader of the Liberal National Coalition. And your top three candidates are Susan Lee, Angus Taylor and Dan Tehan. Like, that's a fucking joke.
Yeah.
That is an absolute joke. That those are the leading candidates to take over as leader of the opposition in the federal parliament. I mean,
yep.
Those are not strong contenders. They are not serious people. Like, they're just not.
No.
It's just, like, I don't think it's because they're holding the reins of power and you've got much stronger candidates newer to the party who are sitting on the backbench missing out on an opportunity to shine. Like, I don't really think you have that strength on the bench of the Liberal Party in the House of Reps. There might be the odd person in the Senate that you might look at and go, that would be a more reasonable leader, but only relatively.
Yeah. Well, on election night, we had a watch party and we were discussing this, and my running mate Simon Simpson said, because James McGrath happened to be up on screen, and he said, well, what about James McGrath? And I said, oh, he's a senator. Then we had a very fascinating sort of rabbit hole around, how they could possibly get James McGrath out of the Senate into the House of Reps. And I said, well, you'd have to force a by-election, which they would then lose.
Yeah. Which is what Canada's in the process of doing, right?
So there's possibly, if I was doing this as an exercise in actually caring about who the Liberal leader is, I would point to Julian Leeser as possibly the only person who could actually, is sufficiently a moderate and reasonable person who could begin the work of raising it to the ground and rebuilding it correctly in Menzies' image, which guarantees that he will never be a contender. The only other contender is Andrew Hastie, who at the time of recording ruled himself out of it today.
Ruled himself out.
And I think on a strategic level, I read somewhere again over the weekend that because he's former defence and former SAS, he was the defence spokesperson. And I read somewhere that he had been frustrated that Dutton would not give him an opportunity to move into a more general portfolio to expand his experience. So I suspect that Hastie has ruled himself out, A, because he doesn't feel ready. He needs more experience across, Treasury,
something else,
other portfolios. And also, because it is absolutely a poison chalice. Everyone's already talking about Labor being set up for at least another 2 terms. so this term and another one, whoever leads the Liberal Party in the wake of Dutton's exit is never going to be Prime Minister, is never going to probably even lead them to the next election. And who wants to take on that thankless task?
That is why Andrew Hastie has ruled himself out. I will guarantee.
Yeah, he's not.
It's not because he doesn't have the ambition.
Oh, no.
It's because he or somebody has counselled him and said, "Don't. There's no point. You will
just wait.
You will just break yourself on the rocks.
Yeah.
If you do this,
don't squander your leadership potential at this point in time.
Just sit back and wait.
Yeah.
And they'll probably end up giving it to Dan Tehan, is my guess.
Yeah.
Which out of the three is probably the safest pair of hands? I know. But this is what I've been saying for quite some time. This is when people go, God, Peter Dutton, really? And I go, but look around.
Yeah. Look who's standing behind him.
So,
I've got a pet rock that would do a better job.
I mean, Dan Tehan, he was only the second most boring man in Parliament, but now Paul Fletcher's retired. He's the most boring man in Parliament.
Yeah.
Dan Tehan is the guy they send out on Monday morning to try and take the focus away from whatever dumb shit happened on the weekend. It's the only thing that he's been good for.
Yes.
But that is literally going to probably be the job for the next 3 to 6 years.
Yeah.
Right? Is they need a placeholder. They need someone who is not long-term.
What a time to be alive,
Prime Minister in waiting. They need someone who will just blob along until the second coming.
Yeah. So I think it's going to be.
I'll put my money on Dan Tehan. That's my bet.
Andre's prediction is Tehan. This is going to be fascinating to come back to haunt us. I suspect, and this might be my feminine wiles biasing me. I suspect in classic middle-aged white man, corporate Australia fashion, they will shove Susan Lee out and off the glass cliff to take the fall for the succession of idiotic white men who have driven the whole thing into the ground, and
also
they will leave
that
it to
helps
her to
them
clean
prove
up the
that
mess.
women aren't up to the job.
Exactly. Yes.
When she fails at an unwinnable job, they'll be like, "See, that's why we don't put women in."
I agree.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think Susan Lee will be leader, and she will be leader because it's an opportunity to go, okay, enough of that. Let's put a bloke back in charge.
It's an opportunity for them to go, look, we're listening to the electorate, we're putting a woman in charge because, you guys apparently like women. And then in 3 to 6 years' time, they'll go, oh, well, she's been hopeless at it. We need to put a man in charge.
No, she won't lead into the next election. They'll replace her with somebody else before the next election.
Probably Angus Taylor.
And then that person will be replaced because they'll lose. And again, you'll put Susan Lee back in charge or something.
If she survives, yeah.
Nothing I've seen over the last little while gives me any kind of confidence that whatever choice they make will be a smart, strategic choice. They failed to learn any of the lessons from the last election. Nothing I've seen over the past 48 hours suggests that they're learning any lessons this time around. I think they'll make a poor choice and a choice that won't deliver the sort of change and renewal that they really need. It didn't happen in WA. It didn't happen in Victoria. It hasn't happened in New South Wales. I don't see it happening nationally.
Although there was a joke floating around WA media, I think in the wake of Saturday night, that Basil Zemplis is going to put himself forward to be Liberal leader.
I think that's...
You wait.
I think that's great.
You wait.
Yeah.
I love that idea. He'll
do a Christian Porter.
Yes.
He'll do a Christian Porter.
Yes. Actually, no.
I love it.
That was 100% a joke, but I think you're right. I think in 3 to 6 years' time, they will replace Susan Lee.
I'll have to put Basil into a safe seat somewhere.
Yeah.
Wherever those safe seats are. I don't know.
There's no safe seats anymore. But yeah, this recording will come back to haunt us in 3 to 6 years' time when Basil makes his move. Because
I'll wear it.
And on behalf of all of WA, we apologise in advance to the rest of the nation for inflicting him upon you. On that happy note, Steve, thank you so much for this very long therapy session for Andre and I.
Thanks, Steve. It's been great speaking to you again.
You're most welcome. Thanks for having me again, and I hope you both get a chance to recoup and recover after the efforts of the last months for you both.
Yes.
Well, thanks very much, Steve.
We need to wait for the Senate count to finish before we can start talking about us, but
Indeed. Indeed.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve.
See ya.
Thank you.
So, at the time of editing and producing this episode, Adam Bandt has conceded defeat in Melbourne, which means Albanese has indeed taken out two party leaders in the one election, an unheard of achievement in Australian politics. The Nationals' Deputy Leader, Perrin Davies, has also lost her Senate seat in New South Wales. And at the time of recording this outro, Jackie Lambie looks like she's in trouble in Tasmania, although she may yet pull through. But as the ostensible leader of the Jackie Lambie network, if she fails to be re-elected, that would make three party leaders and one deputy leader who did not survive this election, which is astounding. If you've been consuming any of the commentary produced since election night, you'll probably have noticed a theme emerging in the analysis with a focus on how Liberal moderates have either abandoned or been driven from the party over the last 15 or so years as the party has lurched further and further to the right. Andre is one of them. Now, if your perception of the Liberal Party has been formed by what you've observed of them since Kevin Rudd became Prime Minister in 2007, then you might be wondering how Andre fits into the Democrats. And the answer is quite well, actually. I keep teasing him that he joined the wrong party and that he should have been a Democrat from the get-go. But there are still a number of people like Andre in the Liberal Party. In the electorate of Banks, where my colleague Philip Pearce ran, David Coleman preferenced the Democrats' third on the Liberal how to vote card. And when I expressed my surprise about this to Andre, he said, David wouldn't be out of place in the Democrats, which surprised me even more because by this stage, I didn't think there would be anyone left in the Liberal Party who wouldn't be out of place in the Democrats. Although after this election, they are much fewer in number. David Coleman lost Banks to Labor after all. Assessing and analysing the full results of this extraordinary election is beyond the scope of this episode, which is already far too long as it is. But I think what this election has revealed is that there is an increasingly large cohort of the electorate who do not feel represented by anyone and who will decide, election by election, who they prefer to be in government. I think it's dangerous for any political party, and indeed any independent, to assume that support in one election is guaranteed in the next. The political environment is shifting and reshaping itself before our eyes. The current focus on primary vote may need to be reconsidered, and maybe we should be looking at the two-party preferred figures for a better assessment of the mood of the electorate instead. Because a lot of commentators and analysts are harping on about Labor winning more than 90 seats with a primary vote of 34%. But on the two-party preferred vote, they're leading roughly 55% to 45% over the coalition. And considering that the primary vote for others, which is minor parties and independents, looks like it's higher than the coalition's primary vote in this election, the two-party preferred vote may be a more accurate reflection of the wishes of the electorate than primary votes. If Labor had a primary vote of 55%, no one would be questioning how they won 94 seats, which is what the AEC's tally room is currently projecting. A clear majority of the electorate preferred a Labor government over a coalition one, even if they gave their first preference to an independent or a minor party. When forced to choose between Labor and the coalition, they chose Labor to form government. In future elections, I don't think it's guaranteed that the coalition will retain opposition status. Eventually, we might have a new opposition, whether it be a party or an alliance of independents and other minor parties. And once we have a new opposition, then we have an opportunity for a government that is neither Labor nor coalition. Now, that is a discussion that deserves its own episode. So once the final results are known, once all the currently undecided seats have been determined and we have the Senate results back, and we have new leaders for the Greens, Nationals and Liberal parties, I'll see if Steve is up for a proper reading of the political entrails and what we can work out about the greatly reshaped political environment we're in. Keep the Bastards Honest is brought to you by the Australian Democrats. This episode was edited and produced by me, Elana Mitchell. If you'd like to keep in touch, you can find us on Facebook, the platform formerly known as Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Spoutable, YouTube, and TikTok by searching for Australian Democrats. And you can see what we stand for, what we value, and what our policy positions are at our website at democrats.org.au. Email us at info@democrats.org.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.